This presentation follows on from Imme's last slide, really, about the indirect impacts of resource scarcity on developing countries' growth prospects, both positive and negative. So what I'll be talking about is not about the direct impacts in terms of water scarcity or land scarcity on production possibilities in countries, but rather on how those scarcities will affect policy actions and also private sector activity from other countries, particularly developed countries, and how that will affect the developing countries' own economic prospects. Now, I'm going to talk about that in relation to a study that we did focusing on growth in a carbon-constrained global economy. So it focused specifically on carbon as the resource constraint. But the reason why it's relevant is because the methodology we used is equally applicable to other natural resources. So it's one approach we could use within this report to analyse some of the potential growth impacts and policy responses facing developing countries at this time. So this is quite a brief presentation. I'm not going to run through this in any detail, but just to explain to you the sort of structure of the methodology that we used. We took a number of mitigation policies that are currently on the table and being discussed, policies which predominantly developed countries would like to introduce to reduce carbon usage. For example, these are both policies that states are introducing, such as carbon taxes, and also the private sector, such as carbon labelling, which is something that tends to be, or has been up till now, a voluntary initiative introduced by private sector actors, but which may get adopted as public sector policy going forward. And what we did is we assessed the impact of these policies on developing countries by focusing on specific transmission mechanisms. So these were some of the things that Imme was talking about. Trade, obviously the impact on prices of imports and exports, and also on export opportunities facing developing countries, and the resulting impact that would have on jobs. Secondly, foreign direct investment. Clearly, where there are new opportunities for FDI, that contributes to capital accumulation and technological transfer, which can stimulate growth. Financial flows, again, this contributes to capital accumulation. Rates of technological innovation and transfer. Changes in consumer preferences. If consumers are getting more environmentally aware, then their patterns of demand are likely to change. And private sector responses will reflect that as well, so that's where the sort of carbon labelling type initiatives come in. They're responding to consumer demand, sometimes driving it to some extent as well. And also aid, which may interact with some of these things, and probably should interact with these things to compensate losers, etc., and fill gaps where assistance isn't coming through private mechanisms. Now, the different mitigation policies have effects through different combinations of these transmission mechanisms. So not all the transmission mechanisms are relevant in each case, in relation to each mitigation policy. So, for example, I'm going to talk through one example of the carbon tax policy and the impact that might have, and that would be mainly through trade and FDI, whereas RED Plus would mainly be through financial flows and probably aid. So they're quite different kinds of transmission mechanisms, but this is the framework that we used to basically systematically go through the types of effects that these different policies could have on developing countries. So, just one example of one of these mitigation policies that we analysed, a carbon tax. Assume a carbon tax is imposed in developed countries. It's on the table, different forms of carbon tax are on the table, highly likely to be implemented, has already been implemented in many countries. First effect that we thought about was the fact that it would increase the price of carbon-intensive imports into developing countries, which, all else being equal, will have a negative welfare effect in those countries. It will also shift patterns of demand and investment into developing countries without the tax. So if the price of production or the cost of production in developed countries with the tax goes up as a result of the tax, then there may be increased demand for products produced in countries without the tax because they're going to be cheaper. And as a result of that, there may also be increased investment into those countries because they are lower cost countries, and so you will gain a competitive advantage. So this provides actually an opportunity for developing countries in terms of technological spillovers from FDI, increased exports and industrialization. Of course, it's highly controversial, and this is also something that's termed carbon leakage because it basically adds up to an effect which undermines the effectiveness of mitigation in developed countries. So it's seen as a very negative outcome. But nonetheless, it still represents an purely economic opportunity for developing countries. Also, it might be offset by border tax adjustments, which is what the debate has been about largely in developed countries. Obviously, they don't want to lose their competitiveness, so it may well be that border tax adjustments would also be imposed to prevent those kinds of carbon leakage effects. The issue with border tax adjustments is that would prevent developing countries from benefiting from these kinds of opportunities, but it could also, in the way it is applied, act as a protectionist measure more widely than that and have quite negative consequences for developing countries who export other kinds of products. So it could have quite negative effects depending on how it is actually implemented. Another source of, another kind of transmission mechanism relates to the impact on comparative advantage. So, for example, if capital-intensive methods tend to use more fossil fuel than labour-intensive methods of production, then a carbon tax might create a shift in the comparative advantage towards countries with high labour endowments. And of course, many developing countries have high labour endowments, so that could be an opportunity for them as well. It would result in increased returns to labour relative to capital, and so more jobs and higher wages potentially. So that's another possible source of benefit for developing countries. What we did then was develop a typology of countries because clearly this is going to have differential impacts on different types of countries. So we divided countries along a range of dimensions which are listed here, whether they are importers or exporters of carbon-intensive products, whether they are relatively carbon-intensive in production or relatively energy efficient, whether they're industrialised or agricultural, whether they have a good investment climate and institutional mechanisms or not, whether they're oil importers or exporters, have carbon assets or don't. There's a whole range of dimensions which will determine the impact of these policies on those countries. So we divided countries up according to these sort of classifications, and then we then assessed the growth impacts and policy responses for each of these different types of countries. So in relation to our example of the carbon tax, you could conclude that countries with a good investment climate could potentially or more likely to benefit from these carbon leakage opportunities, and so if they wanted to maximise that, they could create incentives to attract that kind of investment, and that would enable them to scale up that kind of production. Question is that a sustainable policy response? Because that would put them on a high carbon growth path or trajectory, which is obviously not ideal and may result in the long run in them having to have higher mitigation costs in future. So not necessarily a sustainable option. Countries which don't have a good investment climate are much less likely to be able to attract any kind of investment in these areas anyway. And so they won't benefit from that, and they will probably suffer from higher prices as a result of the higher costs of imported products which are carbon intensive. Question mark, do they need compensation then as a result of developed country mitigation policies which hurt their economic prospects? So we think this methodology is also relevant for analysing the impacts of a wider set of natural resources. Energy, land and water are all potentially valid objects for this kind of analysis. You would need to do the same kind of process, identify the likely indirect impacts of policies in those areas. Now, it's a bit harder in those areas because for our study, which was about mitigation policies, there's already a set of policies on the table being discussed, which provided us with a clear set of issues to look at. That isn't the case in relation to these other natural resources so much. As we've been talking about, there isn't necessarily an international governance mechanism for them. So we need to think more carefully about what the policy options are, what the likely behavioural effects are, and the private sector responses, etc., in order to come up with that initial list of the kinds of changes that we can expect going forward that will affect developing countries. And then we would need to examine, using the same transmission mechanisms, we would need to examine the impacts on developing countries. Now, they are the same kinds of transmission mechanisms. Obviously, we would expect a lot of the impacts to come through trade and FDI and capital flows, etc. Land is a case in point, obviously. What we've been talking about already today is the increased foreign direct investment into land. In principle, as we've talked about, scarcity should drive up the returns to the scarce resources, land and water, for example. So countries which have those assets should be able to capitalise on that. In practice, that doesn't seem to be happening in many cases. So a question is how to, what's going wrong there, and how can we ensure that countries better capture the rents associated with their assets. So then we would assess growth impacts by type of country, and that would enable us to come up with a set of kinds of policy recommendations relating to different kinds of countries. So that's it, really. I think it would be an interesting approach to consider in relation to the other natural resources. It provides quite a clear methodology for analysis. I think it's equally applicable in land and water, and clearly in energy, which is already highly related to the sort of carbon-intensive analysis that we did for this report already. Okay, that's it. Thank you.